Sherlock Holmes and the Man Who Spoke, in Riddles. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was in the chill of an unusually bleak March morning that I found myself once again seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, the air thick with the faint aroma of his pipe and the rustle of newspapers about him. The fire burned low in the grate, casting the room in a shifting half-light that seemed to match the restlessness of my companion. He was sprawled in his chair with that singular combination of languor and latent energy which told me his mind was at work, if not yet entirely engaged. My own morning had been unremarkable, my attention divided between the day's medical notes and the headlines of the Times, when the door was flung open and the brisk tread of Inspector Lestrade broke the calm. The man's face bore that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and consternation which I had come to associate with his visits. Satisfaction that the matter was one for official attention, consternation that it was also one requiring Holmes. "Holmes," Lestrade began without preamble, "we've something you'll want to hear, though I'd wager you'll think it's nonsense until you've seen it yourself. There's been a death in Limehouse, a merchant by the name of Barnaby Fletcher, found in his own locked study at midnight. No sign of forced entry, no weapon, no wound, and yet—" He paused, clearly relishing the next words. The man's mouth was filled with strips of paper, each with a line of writing upon it. "Riddles, Holmes. Riddles in the victim's own hand." Holmes' eyes, which had been fixed on the ceiling a moment before, came to rest sharply on Lestrade's face. "And you are certain they were in his hand, not a forgery? The writing matches his ledgers and letters perfectly. We've had our man compare them," said Lestrade. "What's more, every window was latched from within, the key in the lock, and his valet swears he'd heard no sound all evening. Yet when the butler came in to bring him his late tea, there he was, slumped over the desk, cold as stone." I could not restrain my astonishment. "And you say there was no mark on him, no sign of poison?" "Nothing. Our doctor says he might have died of shock, though from what, he cannot guess." Lestrade gave a short, uneasy laugh. "If this doesn't have your stamp of devilry, Holmes, I'll hand in my badge." Holmes rose with that sudden grace of movement which betrayed the excitement beneath his calm exterior. "A locked room, a dead man, and a sheaf of riddles in the mouth," he murmured. "How delightfully irregular. Tell me, Lestrade, were the riddles coherent?" The inspector shifted uncomfortably. "Coherent enough, though none of us could make head or tail of them. The first read, 'I'm taken from a mine and shut in a wooden case, from which I am never released, and yet I am used by almost every person.' The others were no less obscure." Holmes's gaze grew distant, his long fingers drumming lightly on the mantelpiece. "Pencil lead," he said absently, "though that may be irrelevant." He glanced at Lestrade. "Was anything taken from the study?" "Nothing. The desk was in order, his papers neatly stacked. There was, however, a scrap of a letter in the grate, half-burnt. It was addressed to him from someone signed only with the letter R. Holmes' smile was faint but unmistakable. "And you think the matter nonsense?" "No, Lestrade. This is method. Method wrapped in theatricality. You have done well to come." An hour later, we were rattling through the misty streets toward Limehouse in a hansom cab, the wheels splashing through rain-slick cobbles. Holmes spoke little, but when he did, it was to observe the smallest details of our passing environment. A man carrying a case of carpenter's tools in the drizzle, the faint trace of iodine on the wind from the riverfront, the soot-blackened laundry fluttering above narrow lanes. "I do not yet know," he said at last, "whether our merchant's demise was intended to be a message, a puzzle, or a diversion. But I will wager that before the day is out, we shall have encountered a man who speaks in riddles not only on paper, but in every utterance. And when we do, Watson, we must listen very closely indeed." The hansom drew up before a tall, narrow house of brick, its windows glistening from the morning's rain. Inside, the air was close with the scent of ink and old ledgers. Fletcher's study lay at the end of a dim hall, the door still locked and guarded. Lestrade opened it for us, and we stepped into a room that bore the unmistakable stamp of a man who lived by accounts and exactitude. Everything in place, yet the stillness of it felt unnatural, as though the very air had been sealed with him. On the desk, the victim's body remained just as Lestrade had described it, head bowed, hands resting lightly on the polished surface, and the faintest trace of something white at the edge of his lips where the riddles had been found. Holmes circled him once, eyes roving, pausing at the fireplace, then the bookshelf, then at a narrow, almost imperceptible scratch upon the window frame. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the dust upon that sill, and there, no more than a few grains of something metallic. I should like a small sample, if you please." As I collected it, Holmes's gaze lingered on the half-burnt letter in the grate. He bent, took it up with his tweezers, and studied the curling edges. "An amateur would burn a letter for concealment. A professional," he murmured, "would burn it for emphasis. And our culprit, I think, is no amateur." He straightened, his expression unreadable. "Come, Lestrade. I must speak to the household, particularly to the valet who heard nothing and the butler who found the body. I have an idea that their silences may prove more instructive than their words." It was then, as we turned to leave the study, that I noticed something I had not seen before, a small slip of folded paper tucked beneath the leg of the inkstand. I pointed it out to Holmes, who plucked it up and unfolded it without comment. Written in the same hand as the others, it contained but a single line. "The answer you seek is the question you fear to ask." Holmes read it once, twice, then slipped it into his pocket. "Yes," he said softly, "we are dealing with a man who speaks in riddles indeed." Chapter 2. Holmes considers the riddles. The fog was lifting a little as we emerged from Fletcher's narrow street, but the air still carried the damp heaviness of the river, pressing in on the senses. Holmes had said almost nothing since we left the house, his long stride forcing me to keep pace as we made for the Strand to hail a cab. Lestrade had been called back to confer with his men, leaving us momentarily alone. I had learned long ago that Holmes's silences were often the prelude to some keen stroke of insight, and so I refrained from questioning him, though my mind was brimming with the oddities of the scene we had just left. The locked door, the unmarked body, the riddles stuffed between the lips. Each of these elements was strange enough on its own, yet together they formed something utterly baffling. We secured a hansom and set off toward Baker Street, the wheels clattering over the slick cobblestones. Holmes sat back in the corner, his eyes half closed, one long finger resting against his temple. "Watson," he said at last, "did you note the order in which the riddles were placed within the mouth?" I admitted that I had not, beyond the first one Lestrade had read aloud. Holmes opened his eyes and regarded me with a trace of impatience. "It is a curious thing to take the trouble to compose several riddles, commit them to paper, and then arrange them with such care in the mouth of the victim. Not a single sheet was creased or torn. Whoever did this worked without haste." He paused, his gaze drifting to the passing shop fronts. "That alone tells us something about the time of death and the nature of our adversary." I ventured that it seemed more like a theatrical gesture than a practical one, to which Holmes nodded faintly. "Theatrical indeed, but theatre has its uses. A play is meant to be watched, Watson, and a gesture such as this is intended for an audience, either us, the police, or someone yet to see it. The question is, who?" He drew from his coat the folded slip we had found under the inkstand and smoothed it upon his knee. "And then there is this. The answer you seek is the question you fear to ask." It has the tone of a challenge, don't you think? A prod, designed to unsettle the mind. The cab rattled on, and Holmes's gaze seemed to turn inward. You remarked upon the absence of a wound, and Lestrade mentioned no poison being detected. That may change with a more thorough examination, but I am inclined to suspect an influence not yet visible. You see, in such matters, the cause of death may be hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be read like the solution to a cipher." He tapped his fingers on the leather seat. "Our merchant dealt in shipping contracts and exotic goods, Watson. Limehouse is the natural haunt for such trade, and also for certain less reputable enterprises. A man of his means and connections could have made friends, or enemies, in many quarters." I could not help recalling the faint metallic dust Holmes had directed me to collect from the window-sill. I asked if it might be a clue, and Holmes gave a thin smile. "It may be the most significant fragment of the morning, or it may be nothing. The key lies in matching that dust to an act performed in that room before or after Fletcher's death. That, combined with the scratch on the frame, suggests the possibility of ingress or egress not by the door, but through that very window, yet the latch was fastened." He raised a hand before I could interrupt. "Yes, I am aware that Lestrade will insist it was impossible. Impossible crimes are the most satisfying to resolve." By the time we reached Baker Street, Holmes had fallen silent again, his mind no doubt arranging the facts into one of those mental diagrams I had seen him employ in other cases. Inside, he went at once to his chemical table, setting down the small vial of metallic grains I had gathered. He began testing them with acids and reagents, making brief, clipped notes. I busied myself with tea and a fresh fire, but my attention was drawn again and again to Holmes's figure, bent over the delicate apparatus, the faint hiss of reaction and the sharp tang of chemicals filling the room. At length, he straightened, holding up a minute residue on a glass slide. "Iron mixed with traces of tin," he said, "but of a type used in certain maritime fittings. And here, see the residue of salt, not from the air, but from direct contact with seawater. Our visitor, whoever he was, carried the sea with him into that study." He set the slide down with care and paced to the window. "Now consider, Watson. If a man wished to visit Fletcher unseen, and Fletcher's study overlooked a narrow street with no easy approach, what might he do?" I suggested the possibility of a rope or some contrivance from the roof, but Holmes dismissed it with a shake of the head. Too conspicuous in daylight and too great a risk of discovery. No, this was the work of one accustomed to quiet, purposeful entry, perhaps by means known only to those familiar with certain trades. A seafaring man might manage it, especially one with reason to avoid the door. He stopped suddenly, turning toward me with that abrupt focus I knew so well. "And you see, Watson, the riddles. What could be more natural to a man whose mind is bent upon secrecy and misdirection? Our quarry enjoys the game as much as the result." The remainder of the afternoon passed in the peculiar half-quiet that precedes the next move in Holmes's investigations. He penned a note and dispatched it by messenger, refusing to tell me to whom it was addressed. He sorted through his clippings of past cases, pulling out certain articles about maritime thefts and a series of coded letters sent to the police the year before. When I pressed him for details, he merely replied, "Patience, Watson. The man who speaks in riddles will answer one of mine before the day is out." It was near evening when the reply came. A brief note, unsigned but in a hand I did not recognize. It contained a single riddle. "The more you take from me, the bigger I get. What am I?" Holmes read it without a flicker of expression, then set it aside. "A hole," he said simply. "The man is toying with us." He reached for his coat. "Come, Watson. We must pay a call in Limehouse again, and this time we shall begin with the neighbors. The dead man's study was silent, but I have a feeling the street outside was not." We stepped once more into the thickening dusk, the lamps along Baker Street winking into life, and I could not shake the sense that Holmes had already fixed upon the outline of our adversary, an outline he would not yet share. The riddle maker was close at hand, and I suspected it would not be long before his voice was heard in more than paper and ink. Chapter 3. The Street That Heard. Nothing. The journey back to Limehouse was made in that heavy twilight which seems to come more from the press of damp air than the descent of the sun. The lamps along the wharves glowed faintly through the mist, each halo of light blurred as though by an unseen hand. Holmes, seated beside me in the cab, said little, though his eyes moved constantly, sweeping over the shop fronts and alleys as if each might contain the loose thread he sought. I could not rid myself of the thought that the man who wrote such riddles might even now be watching our return, unseen in the crowd. The cab clattered to a halt, and we stepped into the narrow lane that ran behind Fletcher's house. The street was lined with brick dwellings and small warehouses, their windows either shuttered or dimly lit, the cobbles underfoot slick with the sheen of recent rain. Holmes moved at once to the rear of Fletcher's property, pausing to study the wall and the narrow strip of pavement that separated it from the opposite buildings. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "how close the walls stand here. A man with skill and nerve could pass from one to the other without setting foot on the ground." I followed his gaze upward to the row of eaves, barely 10 feet apart at their widest, and felt a faint chill at the thought of a figure slipping across in darkness. Holmes crouched, examining a drain pipe that ran the height of the wall. There, faint but distinct in the weak lamplight, were marks that might have been left by a rope or cord. He traced them with one gloved finger, his face unreadable, before rising and turning toward the narrow back door of the adjoining warehouse. The door was opened by a stooped old man in a stained apron who regarded us with the wary expression of one long accustomed to unwanted visitors. Holmes introduced us with his customary politeness and asked if the man had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. The old fellow shook his head. "Quiet as you like, sir. Not a step in the lane, save the watchman making his rounds." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you see the watchman?" The man hesitated, then admitted he had not, but had heard the tap of his staff on the cobbles. "He always comes by on the hour," the man said. "I'd stake my name on it." Holmes thanked him, and as we stepped away, remarked softly, "A curious certainty, Watson, to swear to a sound and not the sight of the man." We continued along the lane, speaking with 2 more residents, a sharp-eyed woman who lived above a chandlery, and a dockhand who claimed to have been in his cups the whole evening. Each professed to have heard nothing out of the ordinary, yet both described the same sound at roughly the same hour, the steady tapping of the watchman's staff. Holmes made no comment, but recorded the times carefully in his notebook. I began to see a pattern emerging, though its meaning was beyond me. We ended our circuit at the far end of the lane, where a narrow archway opened onto the riverside. The air here was sharper, tinged with salt and the faint reek of tar, and the fog off the water was thicker still. Holmes stood for some time at the mouth of the archway, his eyes fixed on the dark water where a few lantern-lit barges rocked gently at their moorings. "Consider, Watson," he said quietly, "that our man may have had no need to enter the street at all. The river is as much a thoroughfare as any road in this quarter. A small craft could have brought him to within a few yards of Fletcher's window, and the tide last night would have been high enough to ease his passage." He turned abruptly and began retracing our steps toward Fletcher's house, the tails of his coat stirring in the damp air. When we reached the front door, the butler admitted us without hesitation, clearly now accustomed to Holmes's comings and goings. Holmes asked to speak with the valet, who soon appeared, a pale, neat young man with a manner bordering on the overly precise. He repeated his earlier account. Fletcher had dined alone in the study, had ordered no callers, and had dismissed him before 9 o'clock. Holmes questioned him closely about Fletcher's habits, his visitors, and any correspondence he might have received in the days preceding his death. The valet hesitated only once, when asked if Fletcher had been expecting a letter the previous night. I cannot say, sir," he replied, though the faint tightening about his mouth told me he could. Holmes let the matter rest for the moment, but his gaze lingered on the man for several seconds before he dismissed him. We ascended once more to the study, where the air seemed no fresher for the hours that had passed. Holmes moved at once to the window, unlatching it and leaning out over the sill. "Note the angle, Watson. From here, a man could easily throw a light cord to the eaves opposite, provided he had the skill." He withdrew, shut the window again, and began pacing. I knew this rhythm well. It was the measure of a mind weighing possibilities against the weight of fact. "The riddles," he said finally, "are the key. Not in their answers, those are mere bait, but in their arrangement and delivery. They tell us the killer wanted to be known, yet only by one able to follow his particular chain of reasoning." It was at that moment that Lestrade entered, a folded paper in his hand. "Another one for you, Holmes," he said. "It came to the station half an hour ago, addressed to you by name. Same hand as before." Holmes took it without a word and opened it. Inside was a single riddle. "I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with wind. What am I?" Holmes's lips curved faintly. "An echo," he murmured. "Our friend grows bolder. He is telling us he is near enough to hear our steps, yet hidden well enough that we cannot see him." He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "Come, Watson. We must see the river from another vantage. There is a public house on the quay with windows that look upon Fletcher's Lane. I think we may find the view most instructive." As we left the house, I could not help glancing back toward the shuttered window of the study. Somewhere in the fog and narrowness of Limehouse, a man who spoke in riddles was watching and waiting, and Holmes, I suspected, was already preparing a question that might finally force him to answer. Chapter 4. Faces in the Fog. The public house that overlooked the narrow quay was a weather-worn building with heavy oak beams and windows clouded by the breath of countless patrons. Its sign, a faded painted ship with tattered sails, swung weakly on rusted chains. Holmes led the way inside, his eyes sharp beneath a furrowed brow, as though already calculating every angle and shade of shadow. The warm murmur of voices and the smell of stale ale filled the room. But Holmes's attention was fixed on the narrow street beyond the glass, where the lamplight cast fragmented pools of yellow upon the damp stones. We took a quiet corner table near the window, giving us a vantage point over the lane and the buildings opposite. Holmes ordered a simple supper, though he barely touched it, his gaze flickering between the street and a collection of figures gathered in the room. It was then that I noticed the subtle changes in his demeanor, the tightness of his lips, the sharpened alertness in his eyes. Something, perhaps a sound or a shadow, had caught his notice beyond our immediate view. I followed his gaze to a small group seated near the hearth. A lean man with a hawkish nose who spoke with an easy confidence, a woman whose eyes darted nervously beneath dark lashes, and a quiet man hunched over his tankard as though to hide from the world. They exchanged glances with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion as Holmes occasionally shifted in his seat, observing without seeming to look. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "the players in this drama are not confined to the house or street. The theatre extends to this very room. Our man who speaks in riddles thrives on misdirection, and so do many others in this quarter." He gestured subtly. "Those three, the merchant's business partners, or so I surmise, each with their own stake and no doubt their own secrets." I turned to examine them more closely. The hawkish man, whom Holmes had named, was mid-30s, dressed plainly but with an air of control. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning. The woman, younger and finely dressed despite the setting, seemed restless, her fingers drumming against the table edge. The third was older, grizzled, with a face that had weathered more than a few storms. His silence spoke volumes. Holmes motioned to the barkeep, who brought over a newspaper folded neatly and placed it before us. Holmes pointed to a small notice in the business section. Barnaby Fletcher's firm to dissolve amid allegations of fraud and mismanagement. I caught the flicker of a smile at Holmes's lips. A scandal, Watson, is a powerful motive, and scandal in Limehouse is no less poisonous for being cloaked in silence. The door opened, admitting a new figure who seemed to command attention despite his modest appearance. He was a man of middle height, with a calm but penetrating gaze and the quiet confidence of one accustomed to authority. As he approached the group by the hearth, the woman's restless glance sharpened to something harder. Holmes's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes whispered. "The game grows more intricate." Lestrade wasted no time, taking a seat and exchanging curt words with the others. It became clear that each held pieces of the puzzle, though none volunteered their parts freely. Holmes leaned forward and, in that measured tone which brooked no interruption, began to question them about Fletcher's dealings in recent weeks. The hawkish man, introduced as Mr. Camden, spoke of disputes over shipping contracts and debts. The woman, Miss Linton, was more guarded, hinting at personal entanglements and whispered threats, but offering few specifics. The older man, Mr. Hargrove, remained largely silent, his eyes watching Holmes as if weighing every word before deciding whether to speak. Throughout the questioning, Holmes observed every twitch of muscle, every fleeting expression. When Miss Linton's hand trembled as she refilled her glass, or when Mr. Prape— Camden's smile faltered at a particular question. He made no immediate comment, but his mind seemed to catalogue these moments for later consideration. Between questions, Holmes turned to me. "The manner in which these three carry themselves speaks of tangled loyalties and hidden grievances. Each has cause to wish Fletcher silenced, yet none have the courage to admit as much. The riddles are a statement, a message that this is no simple quarrel, but a carefully woven scheme." As the night deepened, the tavern grew quieter, the regulars drifting away. Holmes stood suddenly, motioning to Lestrade. "It is time we visit another witness, one who was present at the docks the night Fletcher died, a bargeman known as Old Reeve." The journey to the dockside was cold and damp, the fog thickening once again to cloak the world in shadow. Old Reeve's small cabin was a cluttered space filled with nets, ropes, and the scent of seaweed and tar. The man himself was a wiry figure, with skin weathered like driftwood and eyes bright with shrewdness. He spoke freely of a stranger seen loitering near the merchant's property. A man who kept to the shadows, whispering to himself in riddles, or so they say. Old Reeve's description was vague but consistent. A figure of medium height, cloaked with a peculiar gait. "Most folk steer clear of such as him," he said, but he carried a purpose. Holmes listened intently, then pressed for details of the stranger's actions. The bargeman recalled hearing strange noises, a tapping like the sound of a staff echoing through the alley, and glimpsing a flash of paper caught on the wind. "Riddles, perhaps," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming. As we left the cabin, I felt the weight of the night's discoveries settle upon me. The faces we had seen, the half-truths spoken, and the riddles exchanged were threads in a complex web, and Holmes was steadily weaving them into a pattern I was eager yet hesitant to understand. Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat before his board, arranging scraps of paper, notes and sketches. "We have many faces, Watson," he said, "but only one voice behind the riddles. The question is whether we can coax that voice into revealing itself before it vanishes into the mist." I settled beside him, resolved to match his patience and perseverance. The game was afoot indeed, and the man who spoke in riddles was still very much at large. Chapter 5. The red herring emerges. The morning light filtered weakly through the curtains of our Baker Street rooms, casting long, pale shadows across the cluttered desk where Holmes sat immersed in his papers. I had hoped the night's rest might bring some clarity, yet the mystery of Fletcher's death still clung to us like a fog, thick and unyielding. Holmes's face bore the faint trace of weariness, though his eyes retained their piercing focus as he sifted through the fragments of our inquiries. It was shortly before noon when Lestrade returned, this time accompanied by a man whose presence immediately altered the atmosphere. The newcomer was a stocky fellow with a ruddy complexion and sharp eyes that flickered with a restless energy. He introduced himself as Thomas Greville, Fletcher's valet's cousin, and a man who had lately taken an active interest in the affairs of his relative's household. His manner was forward, even brash, and from the outset, he seemed eager to direct the investigation according to his own convictions. "I'll say it plain, gentlemen," Greville declared as he took a seat. "I believe the culprit is the valet himself, young Simmons, a man desperate for money, recently seen near the docks in suspicious company and quick to change his story." Lestrade nodded, seeming relieved to have a tangible suspect. Holmes, however, regarded the man with a measured skepticism. "The convenience of your theory is noted, Mr. Greville," Holmes said quietly. "But convenience is not proof." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, have you any direct evidence beyond your suspicions?" Greville's face tightened. "Only that Simmons was heard arguing with Mr. Fletcher days before the death, and that he was the last to see the master alive." Lestrade produced a small bundle of statements and photographs, presenting them with a flourish as though sealing the case. The valet's alleged debts, the whispered threats overheard in taverns, the furtive meetings, all painted a picture of guilt in broad strokes. Yet Holmes's eyes missed nothing. He scrutinized the documents, then looked toward me with a knowing glance. "It is easy to find a motive in desperation, Watson," Holmes mused aloud, "but the truth must be held in the balance of fact, not supposition." He turned to Lestrade. "Have you verified the timeline of Simmons' movements on the night in question?" Lestrade hesitated. "He claims to have been home by 10, but there are no witnesses to confirm." Holmes's lips twitched. "And the locked study? The riddles? Are we to believe our desperate valet calmly composed cryptic verses and orchestrated an elaborate tableau?" Greville bristled at the implication, but Holmes pressed on. "There is, however, one aspect of Simmons' story that bears further examination. It concerns his whereabouts shortly before Fletcher's death." Turning to Lestrade, he asked for permission to visit the man himself. The inspector agreed, and soon we found ourselves walking toward the small lodgings Simmons occupied on the edge of the dock district. The valet's quarters were sparse and neat, betraying no sign of luxury or ill-gotten gain. Simmons greeted us with a mixture of nervousness and defiance, readily answering Holmes' questions about his recent activities. He admitted to quarrels with his cousin, Thomas Greville, but denied any involvement in Fletcher's death. His account was consistent, and Holmes seemed satisfied enough to withhold judgment, though his gaze remained calculating. As we left Simmons' lodgings, Holmes paused to examine the ground nearby, noting footprints partially obscured by damp earth and refuse. "Observe, Watson, how the prints lead toward the river but circle back as if the bearer hesitated or was being followed." He crouched to inspect a small shard of glass caught in the mud. "And here, a fragment of what appears to be a piece of a broken vial or bottle." Holmes pocketed the shard and motioned me to follow. "We shall test a theory, Watson, though I caution you, it may prove that our obvious suspect is nothing more than a convenient distraction." The day passed in a series of visits to waterfront taverns, warehouses, and alleyways, where Holmes questioned dock workers and petty criminals about any unusual activity in the hours surrounding Fletcher's death. Several mentioned a stranger, a man cloaked and elusive, often seen whispering riddles or cryptic phrases to himself. One witness described a heated argument near the docks, while another recalled a small boat slipping silently through the mist. Holmes listened with quiet intensity, piecing these fragments together as though assembling a puzzle with missing edges. At one point, he paused beside a shipping ledger left carelessly on a table, his eyes scanning the faded ink for names and dates. Note, Watson, the mention here of a cargo consignment labeled simply R, originating from a small vessel often employed in smuggling. When we returned to Baker Street, Holmes retired once more to his chemical apparatus to test the shard of glass, while I reviewed my notes. The shard proved to contain traces of a rare poison derived from a plant native to the Far East, subtle, slow-acting, and difficult to detect. This discovery added a sinister layer to the case, implying that Fletcher's death was no accident, nor the work of a desperate servant. Holmes appeared pensive as he shared this with Lestrade the following morning, warning against premature conclusions. "The poison suggests planning, patience, and knowledge," he said. "But the riddles remain our most enigmatic clue. They are the voice of the killer, speaking from the shadows, challenging us to uncover his purpose." Greville's accusation of the valet had stirred the waters, but Holmes's subtle dismantling of the theory only deepened the mystery. The obvious suspect, it seemed, was indeed a red herring, one designed to mislead and delay. As the day waned, Holmes turned once again to me with that familiar glint of resolve. "Watson, the game is afoot, and the riddles grow more urgent. We must tread carefully, for the man who speaks in riddles has already anticipated our every move." I nodded, knowing full well that the truth lay buried beneath layers of deception, and that we had yet to scratch the surface. Chapter 6. The Hidden Inconsistency. The day had settled into a grey, uneasy quiet when Holmes and I reconvened in the sitting room at Baker Street. The shadows cast by the late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the curtains, mingling with the faint smoke curling upward from Holmes's pipe. His expression was inscrutable as he sat hunched over a scattering of papers and notes. The remnants of our previous inquiries arrayed before him. "Watson," he began, voice low and deliberate, "we have been led down many paths in this labyrinth, yet none has yielded the definitive truth. The accusation against Simmons, the valet, is attractive in its simplicity, but our investigations have shown it to be more distraction than solution." He tapped a sheet before him. "It is in the details, as always, that the hidden inconsistency lies." I leaned closer, eager for his insight. Holmes pointed to the timeline of Fletcher's final evening, carefully compiled from witness statements and the valet's own account. "Consider the moment of death, which we place roughly at midnight, and the precise time when the watchman's staff was heard tapping the cobblestones outside. All witnesses concur that the staff's rhythm was regular and uninterrupted, yet we have this puzzling note of a second tapping, a lighter, uneven sound, reported by one dock worker, a noise that does not correspond to the watchman's rounds." Holmes looked up sharply. "We must ask ourselves, who could produce such a sound, and why has it gone unnoticed by so many?" I offered my suggestion that it might be a signaling device, but Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. This tapping was meant for ears attuned only to it, and it was designed not to draw attention, but to communicate." He pushed the papers aside and rose abruptly, pacing the room. "The riddles themselves are a form of communication, cryptic and deliberately obscured. But if the killer took the trouble to insert these riddles into Fletcher's mouth, why would he also rely on a subtle auditory signal?" I watched him closely as he paused by the window, gazing out over the street below. It is the contradiction here, the inconsistency between the grand gesture of the riddles and the quiet, almost covert tapping that intrigues me. The killer is speaking in riddles, yes, but also in silence. It is a duality. Holmes turned to me with a rare gleam of concern. "I fear, Watson, that this inconsistency may portend a larger deception, one we have yet to uncover." Determined to probe further, Holmes sent me on an errand to the local apothecary to retrieve the latest chemical tests on the residue found at the crime scene. When I returned, I found him already at his table, examining the report with a critical eye. The residue, he explained, was consistent with compounds found in maritime paint, common enough in the docks, but not to be dismissed. Note, too, the presence of a rare alkaloid in the sample, Holmes added. It is a subtle poison, not readily detected and slow-acting. The shard of glass we found at the docks contained traces of this substance, suggesting a deliberate act. He rose and began assembling a new theory. Our man who speaks in riddles is no mere murderer. He is a man of careful calculation, capable of striking without trace and slipping away into the shadows. Holmes's fingers hovered over a map of the dock district pinned to the wall, marking key locations in rapid succession. If he signals with tapping and hides behind cryptic verses, he relies on confusion and misdirection to shield his true purpose. Hours later, as twilight deepened, Holmes called upon me to accompany him to a meeting with Miss Linton, the woman we had seen in the tavern. She had agreed to speak further, though her words were laced with caution. She revealed that Fletcher had recently received a series of threatening letters, all unsigned but bearing the same cryptic style as the riddles found at the crime scene. Holmes's eyes darkened as he listened. Threats couched in riddles, he murmured, are meant to unnerve and bewilder, yet they also serve to announce intent. Miss Linton admitted she had destroyed one such letter, fearing it might bring harm, but had kept others hidden in her possession. She produced a small bundle wrapped in faded silk and handed it to Holmes. Back at Baker Street, we examined the letters closely. The riddles were varied, some seemingly innocuous, others more sinister. Holmes noted subtle variations in handwriting and phrasing, suggesting more than one author, or at least a calculated attempt to disguise the sender's hand. Each letter, Holmes observed, is a piece of the puzzle, one that demands a patient mind and a keen eye to assemble, but they also betray impatience, a desire to provoke response. He looked at me sharply, and it is this impatience that we must exploit. As the night wore on, Holmes sat deep in thought, his mind weaving together threads of sound, symbol, and substance. The hidden inconsistency was no longer a mere anomaly. It was a signpost pointing toward a deeper riddle. And somewhere in the fog and shadows, the man who spoke in riddles awaited the moment when his silence would break. I resolved to match Holmes's vigilance, knowing that the case was entering a darker, more perilous phase, one where every word, every sound, and every shadow might hold the key to truth. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The morning air was thick with fog when Holmes and I set out once again toward the docklands. The familiar clamor of the riverside muffled under a shroud of damp silence. The events of recent days had woven a complex tapestry of clues and half-truths, yet the core of the mystery remained elusive. A riddle wrapped within riddles, much like the cryptic verses left in the mouth of the unfortunate Barnaby Fletcher. Holmes's expression was grave as he led the way through the twisting lanes, his keen eyes alert to the smallest detail, every shadow a possible clue. Our first stop was the modest lodgings of old Reeve, the bargeman who had described the stranger seen whispering in riddles. We found the man pale and drawn, his usual hardiness diminished by an illness I would later learn was not entirely natural. Old Reeve spoke of the stranger with a mixture of fear and fascination, a man who moved like a ghost through the fog, uttering cryptic phrases that seemed to unsettle even the night air. His last words to us were a warning. He's no common criminal, that one. There's something unnatural about his presence. Holmes nodded solemnly, but before we could question further, a commotion outside drew our attention. Rushing to the door, we found a small crowd gathered near the wharf, where a man lay sprawled on the stones, pale and gasping, clutching a scrap of paper stained with ink and blood. The constables moved swiftly, and Holmes was among the first to kneel beside the injured man. The man, barely conscious, managed to utter a single phrase before slipping into darkness. The answer lies beneath the tide. Holmes pocketed the bloodied note and turned to the constables with a sharp command that the man be taken to a surgeon without delay. The air seemed charged with urgency, the fog thickening as if to swallow the mystery whole. Back in the relative safety of Baker Street, Holmes examined the bloodied scrap alongside the riddles recovered from Fletcher's study and the threatening letters held by Miss Linton. The phrase was fragmentary but tantalizing, hinting at secrets submerged beneath the river itself. Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. The case grows stranger, Watson. This man's arrival and his cryptic message suggest a second player in this deadly game, one who wishes to warn, or perhaps to mislead. As the injured man remained unconscious in the care of a trusted surgeon, Holmes and I set about tracing the scrap's origins. The paper was of a type used by local merchants, but the ink was mixed with a rare pigment found only in certain coastal pigments, a detail that suggested a link to the waterfront. Holmes speculated that the man might have been a courier or an unwilling messenger dragged into the web unwittingly. Holmes's mind was restless, and I found him pacing the room late into the night, speaking aloud his theories as if to test them against the silence. Two riddlers now, or one man with many voices. Each communication points us toward the docks, yet the man remains unseen, an echo, a shadow. He stopped suddenly and fixed me with a penetrating look. Watson, we must consider the possibility that the crime is not a single act, but a series, a dark symphony orchestrated to confuse and dismay. The following day brought an unexpected visitor to our rooms. Miss Linton, the woman from the tavern. Her demeanor was changed, the nervous edge replaced by a quiet resolve. She revealed that Fletcher had confided in her a secret plan to expose a smuggling ring operating through the docks, a plan that had earned him many enemies. The riddles, she believed, were not merely threats, but warnings, coded messages meant to protect the innocent and ensnare the guilty. Holmes listened intently, weighing each word. A man who plays with riddles to shield his truth, he mused, is both cautious and desperate. He fears exposure, yet craves justice. He paused, then added, and so, our killer, or killers, may be closer than we imagined, moving within the very circle of those we have already encountered. As dusk fell, Holmes and I returned to the river's edge, where the tide ebbed and flowed with indifferent rhythm. The fog had lifted, revealing the dark shapes of moored vessels, their sails folded like secrets. Holmes pointed to a small boat bobbing near the quay. This craft, Watson, is of a kind used for swift passage, often favored by those wishing to evade notice. He stepped aboard and examined the deck, finding traces of recent activity, a coil of rope, fresh footprints, and the faintest scent of tobacco. The man who speaks in riddles moves silently, but he leaves a trail nonetheless. As we stepped back onto the quay, a shadow detached itself from the alleyway. A figure cloaked in dark garments approached, voice low and deliberate. "You seek the truth in riddles, Mr. Holmes," the stranger said. "But beware, the answers you find may be more dangerous than the questions." Holmes regarded the man steadily, eyes narrowing. "And you are?" The stranger inclined his head slightly, a glint of amusement in his gaze. "A messenger, perhaps a friend, or perhaps the next piece in your puzzle." With that, he turned and vanished into the evening mist, leaving Holmes and me to ponder the deepening enigma. The crime had indeed grown stranger, and the game was far from over. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The encounter with the cloaked stranger had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Holmes, ever composed, seemed to regard the visit as another move in the game, one that demanded careful response rather than impulsive action. Back at Baker Street, the evening air was cool and still, the faint rustle of papers and the occasional crackle from the fireplace, the only sounds to break the silence. Holmes sat at his desk, his fingers steepled, eyes closed in concentration, as if attempting to peer beyond the veil of riddles into the mind of the unseen adversary. "Watson," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "The man who speaks in riddles is playing with us. He has sent warnings, veiled threats, and now a messenger who appears to taunt us. It is clear that direct confrontation would be unwise, but subtlety may prove our greatest ally." His gaze met mine, sharp and unyielding. "I intend to set a trap, one that will provoke our quarry into revealing himself." I listened with a mixture of apprehension and admiration as Holmes outlined his plan. We would return to Limehouse under the guise of following a new lead, an anonymous tip suggesting suspicious activity at an abandoned warehouse near the docks. Holmes proposed that I accompany him, but remain at a discreet distance while he engaged the suspects directly, laying verbal traps and observing their reactions with the keen eye that had earned him his reputation. The next evening found us once more amid the murky shadows of the dock district. The warehouse was a hulking structure, its windows shattered and walls draped in peeling paint and graffiti. A faint flicker of light from within hinted at clandestine activity. Holmes approached the door confidently, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Remember, Watson," he said softly, "our adversary's confidence is born of secrecy. We shall unsettle that confidence and watch for cracks." Inside, Holmes was met by a small group of men whose wary glances betrayed suspicion. They greeted him cautiously, but Holmes's demeanor was disarming, polite yet probing, his words carefully chosen to elicit responses without revealing his intent. He spoke of Fletcher in terms both respectful and inquisitive, weaving subtle insinuations about the riddles and the mysterious notes. As the minutes passed, I observed from the shadows, noting the shifts in posture, the tightening of jaws, and the quickening of breaths. Holmes had begun to sow seeds of doubt and fear, and the men responded in kind, each revealing more in their unease than they intended. One man, tall and thin with a restless eye, kept glancing toward a narrow stairway leading to the upper floor. Holmes pressed gently, referencing a letter Fletcher had received, one that warned of a meeting at the docks. The tall man's reaction was instantaneous, a flicker of panic crossing his features before he masked it with a forced smile. Holmes caught the movement, and I knew the trap was working. Suddenly, the door burst open, admitting a second stranger cloaked similarly to the messenger we had encountered days before. His presence shifted the room's tension palpably. Holmes did not flinch but raised a hand, his voice calm yet commanding. "I believe you have questions for me, as I have for you." The stranger's eyes glinted with challenge. "We know you seek the man who speaks in riddles. Perhaps it is time you heard what he has to say, face to face." Holmes inclined his head slowly. "I have always preferred my conversations unmediated by shadows. Speak plainly, then, if you would be heard." What followed was a dance of words, half-truths, misdirections, and veiled threats. Holmes listened, responding only when necessary, all the while probing for inconsistencies or slips that might betray the stranger's identity or purpose. The tall man from before remained silent, watching with a mix of fear and suspicion. As the meeting drew to a close, the strangers withdrew with a promise to consider Holmes' propositions. Holmes turned to me, his gaze intense. "Watson, tonight we have seen the first true cracks in the mask of our adversary. The challenge is to follow these fissures to their source." Outside, the fog had thickened once more, swallowing the warehouse and its secrets. Holmes and I walked back to Baker Street in contemplative silence, both aware that the game was growing ever more dangerous and that every step now carried the weight of hidden peril. I found myself reflecting on Holmes's remarkable skill, his ability to manipulate the minds of those who wished to deceive, and the thin line that separated hunter from hunted. The man who spoke in riddles was no mere criminal. He was a strategist, a player who delighted in the shadows and the silence between words. As we settled once more in our familiar rooms, Holmes spoke softly, almost to himself. "We must be patient, Watson. The man who speaks in riddles will make his next move soon. When he does, we must be ready not only to hear his voice, but to understand its meaning." And so, the night deepened, carrying with it the promise of revelations yet to come, and the unspoken certainty that the most perilous moment in the game lay just ahead. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The chill of the early morning wrapped around London like a shroud as Holmes and I made our way back toward Limehouse. The fog hung thick and heavy, swallowing the distant outlines of ships and warehouses, muffling the sounds of the awakening city. The events of the previous night had left me with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Holmes, for all his usual composure, wore a crease of concern across his brow, the faint tension in his jaw betraying a mind that had already begun to anticipate the next move. Our destination was the modest lodging of old Reeve, the bargeman who had first spoken of the stranger who whispered in riddles. As we approached the weathered door, a crowd had gathered, neighbors and curious onlookers pressed close, their faces pale with shock and whispering hurriedly. Holmes pushed through, and I followed, catching the sharp scent of smoke mingled with something acrid and unfamiliar. Inside, the scene was grim. Old Reeve lay unconscious upon a narrow cot, his breathing shallow and labored. The surgeon attending him shook his head gravely. "The poor man has been the victim of poison, deliberate and potent," he explained. "Had he not been found so quickly, there would have been little chance of survival." Holmes knelt beside the cot, his fingers deftly lifting the man's hand to inspect the palm where a faint trace of a powdery residue lingered. "Tell me everything you can, Reeve," Holmes urged gently, though the patient was barely conscious. "Who was the last to speak with you? What did they say?" Reeve's eyes fluttered open, and he murmured a single phrase before slipping once more into a restless sleep. "The answer is beneath the tide." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking into us all. Holmes folded his hands tightly, his gaze distant. Outside, the crowd had grown restless, and Lestrade arrived with his usual brisk efficiency. Holmes shared his concerns in low tones. "The man who speaks in riddles is desperate. He seeks to silence those who might unravel his designs. This attack is a message as much as a warning." We moved swiftly to secure the area, questioning those who had been near Reeve's lodging. A young woman who sold bread nearby recalled seeing a shadowy figure lurking in the alley late the previous evening. Her description was vague, but Holmes found it enough to prompt another visit to the docks. At the waterfront, the atmosphere was tense. Men spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Holmes approached a small group gathered near a flickering lamp, his presence commanding attention. "I seek a man, cloaked and mysterious, who speaks in riddles and moves with the tide," he announced. "He has poisoned an innocent man and threatens others. Who among you knows of such a figure?" A grizzled fisherman stepped forward, his face weathered by sun and salt. "There's talk of a shadow on the water," he said grimly. "A boat that comes and goes at odd hours, no flag, no name. Some say the man who commands it speaks in riddles, fooling those who listen." Holmes listened intently, then directed his attention to a narrow slip where a small vessel rocked gently. The boat was old but well maintained, its paint chipped and faded. Holmes inspected the hull and found traces of the same rare pigment detected in the residue on the shard of glass and in the poison used on Reeve. "The connection grows clearer," Holmes said quietly. "Our adversary uses the river as both highway and hiding place." As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. "The culprit is bold and ruthless," he said. "His attempts to silence witnesses show a man who believes the noose tightening, but each strike, each riddle, leaves a thread for us to follow." That evening, a letter arrived, addressed to Holmes in an unfamiliar hand. The paper was thin and yellowed, and the message within was brief but chilling. The tide will claim what it must. Seek no further, or you too shall drown in the silence. Holmes read the note carefully, then turned to me with a steely gaze. The threat is clear, Watson. Our quarry is prepared to go to any lengths to protect his secrets, but threats alone do not make a man invincible. As the night deepened, I sat by the fire watching Holmes at work, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that grew more intricate with each passing hour. The game was far from over, and the man who spoke in riddles was closing in, but so were we. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. The dawn broke grey and unyielding over London, and as Holmes and I convened once more in our Baker Street rooms, the weight of recent events hung heavily in the air. The poisonings, the cryptic notes, the shadowy figures, each thread tugged us deeper into a web of secrets, and yet the heart of the matter remained obscured by smoke and misdirection. Holmes, however, seemed closer than ever to unraveling the knot, his keen mind sharpening to a fine edge as he sifted through the evidence with tireless precision. "Watson," he began, his voice steady but edged with urgency, "we have long chased shadows, but it is time to cast light upon the motive that animates this cruel charade. Motives are the true key to any crime. They give purpose to chaos." He pulled from his desk a sheaf of papers, ledgers, letters, and scraps of paper, some stained with ink and others with something darker. Barnaby Fletcher was more than a simple merchant. His dealings extended beyond mere commerce. They touched the sinews of a smuggling ring that operated under the very noses of the authorities. Holmes unfolded a faded ledger, pointing to entries that detailed shipments labeled with coded symbols and marked with the letter R. These shipments carried goods forbidden by law, and Fletcher's role was not merely that of a businessman, but of an unwilling accomplice, or a man trapped by his own ambitions. He looked up sharply. The riddles, the threats, the attempts on lives, they are all pieces of a struggle for control and silence. I was struck by the complexity of the scheme Holmes outlined. Fletcher had been poised to expose the ring, a decision that had made him a marked man among those who profited from the illicit trade. The riddles were not random, but encoded warnings to those in the know, a desperate attempt to communicate truth while shielding the innocent. Holmes rose and began to pace, his mind clearly racing ahead. Our adversary is no mere criminal, but a strategist, employing psychological warfare to confound and delay. The duality of his methods, the riddles in paper and the subtle signals on the street, speaks to a man who thrives in ambiguity. I asked about the involvement of those we had met, the valet Simmons, Mr. Camden, Miss Linton, and others, and Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Each holds a thread, some tangled with loyalty, others with fear or greed. The key lies in discerning who acts from self-preservation and who from darker intent. Our investigations led us to revisit the tavern where Fletcher's associates had gathered. The atmosphere was thick with unease, and the patrons' conversations dropped to whispers as Holmes and I entered. He sought out Miss Linton, who now seemed more composed, yet guarded. Over tea, she divulged that Fletcher had confided in her about a planned exposé, a list of names and shipments that would bring ruin to many influential figures. Holmes listened intently, then asked, "And who else knew of this list?" Miss Linton hesitated, then named several men, including the grizzled Mr. Hargrove and the hawkish Mr. Camden. Fletcher feared for his life, she admitted. He spoke of enemies who would stop at nothing. As dusk fell, Holmes and I walked the dim streets once more, the fog curling around us like a living thing. He spoke quietly of the game we faced, one where every move was calculated, every word a potential trap. "We are closing in, Watson," he said. "But the closer we come to the truth, the more dangerous the shadows become." Back at Baker Street, Holmes prepared for what he called the final bait, A plan to draw the killer from hiding, to force the Riddler to reveal himself in the presence of those whose silence had protected him thus far. I sensed the culmination of weeks of painstaking work was at hand, and that the true motive behind the crime was about to be laid bare. As I watched Holmes methodically arrange his pieces on the chessboard of this mystery, I felt a surge of anticipation. The man who spoke in riddles had struck deep, but his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. The next move would decide the fate of many and reveal the dark heart at the center of this tangled web. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' Grand Strategy. The chill of early evening had settled upon London as Holmes and I set our plan into motion, the weight of weeks of investigation culminating in this pivotal moment. The fog clung thickly to the streets of Limehouse, wrapping the narrow alleys and shuttered windows in a veil of obscurity that seemed both to conceal and reveal at once. Holmes moved with that quiet confidence which betrayed the careful orchestration beneath his calm exterior. His mind was a chessboard, each piece positioned with deliberate intent, awaiting the crucial moves that would bring the game to its climax. Our first step was to send a carefully crafted message, disguised in the form of a letter, sent to a small circle of Fletcher's known associates. The letter was vague, hinting at new revelations and a gathering that promised to untangle the web of riddles that had so confounded the investigation. Holmes insisted it be anonymous, penned in a hand deliberately disguised, but with hints recognizable only to those intimately connected to the affair. The intent was clear: to provoke curiosity, to draw out the man who spoke in riddles from his shadows. We chose the old tavern by the docks as the setting for this encounter, a place already steeped in the murmur of secrets and suspicion. Holmes' eyes flickered with a rare glint of anticipation as we took our places in a darkened corner, watching as figures began to assemble, drawn by the lure of whispered truths and hidden agendas. Among them were familiar faces: Mr. Camden, his expression guarded; Miss Linton, whose nervous glances betrayed a fragile resolve; and the quiet Mr. Hargrove, whose gaze seemed to pierce the fog itself. Holmes remained quiet, observing as tension coiled and uncoiled within the room. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and careful alliances, each attendee weighing the others with subtle glances and half-hidden signs. Then, as if on cue, a shadow detached itself from the far end of the room, a man cloaked, his presence commanding attention without a word. He carried himself with a deliberate grace of one accustomed to command and secrecy, his eyes sharp and unreadable beneath the low brim of his hat. Holmes rose slowly, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet authority that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have gathered tonight beneath the weight of a shared burden, a burden of secrets, threats, and riddles. We seek the truth behind the death of Barnaby Fletcher, and the man who speaks in riddles has brought us here for reasons he has yet to reveal." A murmur ran through the room, but the cloaked figure said nothing. Holmes continued, pacing the length of the room with measured steps. "This game of shadows and whispers has lasted too long. I propose we end it tonight. Let those who have knowledge step forward. Let the riddles be answered." The tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. Eyes shifted uneasily. The silence was broken only by the scrape of a chair as the cloaked man moved forward, removing his hat to reveal a face etched with cold calculation and a flicker of something more: defiance, perhaps, or desperation. "You seek me, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I am the one who speaks in riddles, the architect of this game, and I have called you here not merely to confess, but to challenge." Holmes met the gaze without flinching. "Speak your riddles plainly, then. The truth fears no light." What followed was a verbal duel, a weaving of cryptic truths and evasions. The man spoke in puzzles, each word laden with double meaning and guarded threats. Holmes countered with calm reason, unraveling the threads one by one, exposing contradictions and hidden motives. The assembled guests watched in a mixture of awe and apprehension as the two minds clashed, the air thick with the electric charge of revelation. At last, the cloaked man's facade cracked. A flicker of frustration betrayed the cracks beneath his carefully constructed mask. Holmes seized the moment. "Your riddles are clever, but they cannot hide the truth. You fear exposure not for yourself alone, but for those whose fates are intertwined with your deception." The man's eyes darted to the others in the room, some of whom now looked away, their faces pale. He took a step back, then spoke with bitter clarity. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, you have forced my hand, but be warned, the truth you seek will shake foundations, and those who fall may not be who you expect." Holmes nodded slowly. Better the truth than the lies that poison the soul of justice. As the room held its breath, the stage was set for the final unraveling. The bait had been laid, the trap sprung, and somewhere beneath the fog and silence, the man who spoke in riddles stood revealed, not yet in full, but close enough to change the course of all our fates. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The thick haze of the night hung heavy over the room, the gaslights casting flickering shadows on the faces gathered within. The atmosphere was charged with an electric tension, the kind that precedes revelation but never guarantees it. Holmes stood near the hearth, his gaze steady and unyielding as the man who spoke in riddles, his cloak now drawn back, revealing a visage marked by cunning and exhaustion, pursued his last verbal defenses. Around us, the faces of Fletcher's associates were taut with anticipation, some betraying barely concealed fear, others resolute in their silence. As the conversation unfolded, I watched Holmes intently, noting the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the faint twitch of a corner of his mouth that spoke of dawning certainty. The man had danced around the truth with practiced skill, weaving riddles and half-truths as if they were a cloak to shield his secrets. Yet Holmes, with his unmatched acuity, was steadily unraveling the strands. Suddenly, Holmes raised a hand, commanding silence. "Enough of riddles," he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. "We have heard your challenges and your threats, but the truth is not a game to be played with words alone. It is a matter of fact, observation, and reason." He took a step forward, eyes fixed on the man before him. "It is time to lay bare the full sequence, the order in which events unfolded, the motives that drove them, and the means by which this web of deceit was spun." The room seemed to hold its breath as Holmes began to speak, his voice steady and deliberate, weaving a narrative that brought light to shadowed corners. He recounted the sequence of Fletcher's final days, the mounting tension with his associates over the smuggling operations, the threatening letters masked in cryptic verses, and the growing desperation that led to violence masked by riddles. Holmes described how the initial crime, the death in the locked study, had been carefully staged to mislead, the riddles themselves a calculated ploy to confuse and delay. The second crime, the attempt on old Reeve, was no random act of cruelty but a deliberate strike to silence a witness and send a warning to others. Holmes explained how the strange tapping heard near the docks was a covert signal between conspirators, designed to coordinate movements and misdirect investigators. As Holmes spoke, he paused to reveal the subtle but damning evidence that had emerged. The rare poison traced to the shard of glass, the coded shipments marked with the letter R, and the inconsistencies in the accounts of Fletcher's closest associates. His words were precise, each detail a stroke painting the full picture of conspiracy and betrayal. "And now," Holmes continued, "I shall name the architect of this tragedy, the man who spoke in riddles to cloak his guilt and manipulate all around him." His gaze swept the room before settling with unerring certainty on Mr. Camden, the hawkish-faced partner who had so carefully concealed his fears and ambitions. Camden's face paled, but he met Holmes's eyes without retreat. "You have no proof," he said, voice tight but defiant. Holmes smiled thinly. "Proof, Mr. Camden, is a collection of facts strung together by logic. Consider the ledger entries you sought to conceal, the forged letters intended to mislead, and the chemical traces that link your hand to the poison. You believed your riddles would confound us, but it is your fear that betrayed you." Camden faltered, then lashed out, accusing others in a desperate attempt to deflect blame, but Holmes's retort was swift and unyielding. "The misdirection ends here. The riddles you planted were no mere games. They were your shield and your confession." The room erupted into murmurs as Lestrade moved forward to place Camden under arrest. Yet even as the weight of justice began to settle, Holmes cast a glance toward Miss Linton and Mr. Hargrove, whose roles, though less direct, were integral to the tangled affair. Turning to them, Holmes spoke with a measured tone. "The smuggling ring was a network of complicity, and each of you played a part, whether in silence or action. The riddles were not only threats, but a language of secrecy shared among you. It is this collective silence that allowed the crimes to flourish." Miss Linton's composure broke, tears streaming down her face as she confessed to destroying letters and withholding truths out of fear. Mr. Hargrove, grim and resigned, acknowledged his part in concealing shipments and misleading inquiries. As the dawn began to break, casting pale light upon the city, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "And so, Watson, the riddles have been answered, the silence broken, and justice set in motion. The game is concluded, but the lessons remain, a reminder that beneath even the most enigmatic puzzles lies the simple human heart, capable of both treachery and remorse." I looked around the room, now quiet save for the low murmur of officers and the soft sobbing of the penitent. The man who spoke in riddles had been unmasked, his carefully woven mysteries laid bare by the relentless light of Holmes's reason. Yet even as the weight of resolution settled upon us, I could not help but feel that the shadows in which this case had thrived would linger long in the minds of all who had been touched by its dark reach. Holmes, ever the enigma, returned to his chair, his gaze distant but serene, ready for the next game to begin. The night had drawn its heavy curtain over London, and the streets outside Baker Street lay swathed in fog, the gas lamps casting halos that flickered like distant lanterns lost in the mist. Inside, the quiet warmth of our rooms contrasted sharply with the cold mystery that had settled upon us. Holmes sat at the desk. A cluster of letters, ledgers, and cryptic scraps spread before him like pieces of some great jigsaw puzzle, each fragment awaiting its rightful place. His long fingers moved deftly, tracing lines of ink, pausing at certain words with a scholar's reverence, while his sharp eyes pierced beyond the surface. I watched him closely, knowing that behind this serene exterior, a storm of thought raged, piecing together threads that had seemed disparate until now. The riddles, the coded messages, the hidden signals, all were parts of a grand design, intricate and dark. "It is a marvel, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low, "how the human mind can weave such webs of concealment, disguising malice with poetry, hiding intent beneath layers of obscurity. But no design, however elaborate, is perfect. Every riddle must, at some point, reveal its answer." He picked up a letter, one among the bundle that had eluded our full understanding until this moment. Observe the subtle variations in ink and the faint impressions beneath the surface. The cipher within is not merely random, but constructed with a deliberate method, a substitution disguised by flourish and misdirection. Holmes paused, his eyes gleaming with sudden clarity. "I have found it." With painstaking patience, he translated the hidden message, his voice a steady rhythm against the silence. "The truth lies beneath the tide, where shadows move with the moon. Seek the place where river and darkness meet, and the veil will be lifted." I felt a chill at those words, for they confirmed what we had long suspected, that the answers were entwined with the very lifeblood of the city's docks, in the secret places hidden beneath the surface. Holmes folded the letter carefully and regarded me. "This location, Watson, is the final key. Fletcher's fate, Camden's desperation, the poisoning of old Reeve, they all converge there." We wasted no time. With Lestrade's aid, we marshaled a small force and set out toward the outskirts of Limehouse, where an abandoned warehouse loomed like a sentinel over the riverbank. The fog pressed close, the faint murmur of water blending with distant cries of gulls and the occasional clang of metal. The warehouse was vast and shadowed, its skeletal framework creaking softly in the night breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt, rust, and decay. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, forming dark corridors that swallowed light and sound. Our footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as Holmes led us deeper, his every sense attuned to the slightest disturbance. Then, from the gloom, a figure emerged, a man cloaked in darkness, his presence both commanding and enigmatic. The man who had spoken in riddles stood before us, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "So, Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, his voice low and measured, "you have found me at last. The riddles have served their purpose, it seems." Holmes did not flinch, his gaze steady and unyielding. "The game is over. The truth will no longer be obscured by cryptic verses and shadowed threats." A flicker of amusement crossed the man's face. "You speak of truth as if it were a simple thing, but truth, like a river, flows and shifts. The riddles were not only my defense, but my challenge to those who would follow." Holmes smiled thinly. "And you underestimated the patience of your pursuer. Each riddle you planted, each signal you sent, left traces, crumbs for the observant to gather." He reached into the folds of the man's cloak and produced a folded parchment, the final riddle, more intricate and haunting than any before. With steady hands, Holmes unfolded it and read aloud. "I am both a path and a barrier. I bind, yet I set free. To find me is to find the end, yet also a new beginning to see." The man's eyes darkened as Holmes looked up. "The river," Holmes said softly, "the tide that concealed your passage, your secrets, and your escape." The cloak dropped from the man's shoulders, revealing the face of a man worn by years of cunning and desperation. His confession spilled forth, of smuggling, of betrayal, of the lengths he had gone to protect his empire and silence those who threatened it. He spoke of riddles as masks, of silence as a shield, and of the darkness he had embraced. Holmes listened, his expression unreadable but resolute. When the confession ended, he spoke with calm finality. "You chose riddles as your weapon, but reason and justice have pierced your veil." As the first rays of dawn filtered through the broken windows, the man who spoke in riddles was taken into custody, his secrets laid bare before the light of day. Around us, the shadows receded, the fog lifted, and the city awoke to a fragile peace. I stood beside Holmes at the window, watching the Thames flow eternal beneath the awakening sky. He turned to me, voice quiet but firm. "There is a certain satisfaction in seeing truth emerge from shadows, Watson. Yet the world remains full of riddles waiting to be solved." I nodded, feeling the steady resolve that defined him, a man forever chasing the elusive light of reason in the depths of human darkness. The moment of recognition had come, and with it the closing of one chapter and the promise of mysteries yet to unfold. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The crisp light of morning filtered through the tall windows of Baker Street, but the energy within our rooms was far from serene. Holmes sat at his desk, his fingers intertwined as his gaze fixed upon the scattered papers before him. The previous evening's revelations had shaken the web of deceit that had cloaked Barnaby Fletcher's demise, and the arrest of Mr. Camden seemed for a time to promise a swift conclusion. Yet Holmes, ever wary of incomplete resolutions, sensed the shadows were far from lifted. As if summoned by our thoughts, the sharp rap of a hurried knock echoed through the hall. Lestrade entered, his face pale but determined. "Holmes, a matter requiring immediate attention," he said, brandishing a telegram. The note bore chilling news. Camden had escaped custody during transport to the station. His flight was swift and desperate, and worse still, it seemed he had taken with him a small satchel containing key evidence, documents and letters that could either damn or exonerate others involved. Holmes rose immediately, his eyes alight with renewed intensity. "The game is not yet over, Watson. Camden's escape is a final gambit, a desperate effort to erase the last traces of his guilt. We wasted no time in preparing to pursue him, gathering what scant information we could about possible routes and contacts. Camden was a man well versed in the labyrinthine alleys of London's docks, and the fog seemed to conspire in his favor. Our search led us through narrow streets, down forgotten passages, and finally to the dimly lit quay where the Thames whispered secrets beneath a canopy of mist. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The usual bustle of sailors and merchants was subdued, as if the city itself held its breath. Holmes moved with purpose, questioning boatmen and dock workers, piecing together the fugitive's trail. It was then we received word from an informant. Camden had been spotted boarding a small craft bound for the continent, intending to slip beyond the reach of British justice. Time was short, and the window for interception narrow. Holmes instructed me to remain with Lestrade to coordinate efforts at the docks while he sought to confront Camden directly. As Holmes vanished into the fog, I stood with Lestrade among the waiting men, the tension palpable. Hours passed in anxious silence until a commotion stirred at the far end of the quay. Holmes emerged, accompanied by Camden himself, disheveled, wary, yet defiant. His capture was swift, aided by Holmes' commanding presence and a promise of no further chase. Back at Baker Street, Camden was confined but unrepentant. His glare was a challenge as Holmes began the final questioning. The satchel he carried had been recovered from a concealed compartment beneath a river barge, the letters and documents intact but bearing signs of hurried tampering. Holmes examined them with meticulous care, each piece revealing more of the network Camden had sought to protect. What emerged was a portrait not only of greed and ambition, but of fear and desperation. Camden had played a dangerous game, his riddles both shield and weapon, designed to confound the law while maintaining his hold over the illicit operations. The letters were attempts at communication within this clandestine world, warnings that became threats as the noose tightened. In the stillness of the night, Holmes spoke quietly to me of human nature and the dark corners of ambition. Camden's final flight was not merely an escape, but a confession. A man cornered resorts to whatever means remain, yet in doing so, he reveals more than he intends. The case, which had begun as an impossible crime shrouded in riddles, was now nearing its close. Yet Holmes remained vigilant, aware that the true test lay not only in uncovering the culprit, but in understanding the complex motives that had woven such a tangled web. As the dawn painted the sky in pale hues, I reflected on the fragile line between justice and deception, and on Holmes's relentless pursuit of truth in a world where shadows often spoke louder than words. The man who spoke in riddles had been caught, but the echoes of his cunning lingered, a reminder that mysteries like the fog on the Thames rarely vanish completely.
Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed. The air in our Baker Street rooms was thick with the scent of tobacco and the faint, lingering aroma of the rare inks Holmes so prized. The investigation had reached a fevered pitch, each moment heavy with the knowledge that the final pieces of the puzzle were close at hand. Camden's capture had stripped away many of the deceptions that once obscured the truth, yet Holmes's eyes betrayed a restless intensity. He knew, as did I, that the final clue, the keystone of the entire mystery, remained elusive.
Hiding just beyond our grasp like a shadow in the fog. Holmes spent hours poring over the documents recovered from Camden's satchel. They were a tangled web of ledgers, coded messages, and fragmented letters, each demanding painstaking analysis. Yet it was not merely the contents that held Holmes's attention, but the subtle peculiarities within. A slight irregularity in the ink's consistency, a barely perceptible alteration in handwriting style, and a curious sequence of symbols that appeared intermittently among the text. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said one evening, gesturing to a particular letter addressed to Fletcher. "These markings, which at first appear to be mere flourishes, are in fact a cipher, an additional layer of communication beneath the riddles themselves." He explained how the symbols corresponded to a simple substitution code, one designed to reveal a hidden message when properly decoded. With patient precision, Holmes worked through the cipher, his fingers moving deftly over the paper as he whispered possibilities aloud. Gradually, the veil lifted, and the concealed message emerged, a detailed account of planned shipments, names of conspirators, and, most crucially, a location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Limehouse, identified as the nexus of the smuggling operation and the final stage of the deadly game. Holmes' eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "At last, Watson. The true heart of the matter is revealed. This warehouse is where our Riddler sought to conceal his greatest secrets and, perhaps, where the final confrontation awaits." We wasted no time, enlisting the assistance of Lestrade and a contingent of officers to prepare for a raid. Holmes's plan was meticulous, ensuring every angle was covered and no escape route left unchecked. The fog hung low over the river as we approached the warehouse, its looming silhouette a dark monolith against the dim glow of the gas lamps. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt, tar, and something far less pleasant, the metallic tang of danger. Rows of crates, barrels, and sacks were stacked haphazardly, and the faintest echoes of movement suggested unseen figures lurking within. Holmes moved with quiet authority, his voice low as he directed the officers with precision. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, the very man who had spoken in riddles throughout the investigation. His cloak was drawn tight, but the defiance in his eyes was unmistakable. "So, Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "you have finally found me, but the game is not yet over." Holmes met him without hesitation. "The game is ours now, and it is time for the final truth." The man's expression faltered for a moment before he laughed softly. "You think you have unraveled the web. You have found my lair, yes, but the riddles I crafted served not only to hide my deeds, but to test those who would seek me. Few have the patience for such puzzles." Holmes smiled thinly. "And yet here we stand, the patient few. Your riddles have brought you to this moment, and now they shall witness your reckoning." As the officers moved forward, Holmes approached the figure, his eyes searching for the last key to the mystery. It was then that he noticed a small folded piece of parchment tucked within the man's coat, a final riddle, more intricate than any before. With steady hands, Holmes unfolded it and read aloud, "I am both a path and a barrier. I bind, yet I set free. To find me is to find the end, yet also a new beginning to see." Holmes's gaze flicked up, piercing the man before him. "The river," he said quietly, "the very tide that concealed your passage and your secrets." In that moment, the man's composure shattered. He confessed to orchestrating the smuggling ring, the murders, and the riddles designed to mislead. His motivations were greed entwined with a desperate desire to protect a network he had built over years. He admitted to using the river as his cloak and the riddles as his shield, believing that the complexity would keep him safe. Holmes listened with cold resolve, then turned to Lestrade. This man will face justice for his crimes, but let this also be a lesson that even the cleverest riddles cannot hide the truth forever. As dawn broke over the city, washing the streets in pale light, the man who spoke in riddles was led away, his secrets laid bare. Holmes and I stood by the window, the weight of the night's revelations settling upon us like the morning mist. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "there is a certain satisfaction in seeing the truth emerge from shadows. But remember, mysteries will always remain, lurking in the folds of this world, waiting for patient minds to unravel them anew." I nodded, feeling the quiet resolve of a man who had witnessed yet another triumph of reason over deceit. The game, as always, was afoot, but for tonight at least, justice had spoken clearly, and the riddles had been answered. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The morning sun cast a pale light over Baker Street, yet inside our familiar rooms, a heavy stillness had settled. The long and winding path of our investigation was nearing its end. But the final act required the careful assembling of all those who had played their part in this intricate drama. Holmes moved with quiet purpose, sending invitations by hand and messenger to the key figures. Fletcher's associates, the men and women whose secrets had woven the tangled web that now lay before us. As the afternoon waned, the guests began to arrive, each carrying the weight of suspicion and anticipation. Mr. Camden was brought in under guard, his face pale but resolute, while Miss Linton and Mr. Hargrove entered with guarded expressions, the shadows of guilt and fear apparent in their eyes. The valet Simmons was present as well, his posture more assured now that the cloud of suspicion had lifted somewhat. Even Lestrade took his place, ready to witness the culmination of weeks of relentless pursuit. Holmes stood at the head of the room, his gaze steady and commanding. He began by recounting the story as it had unfolded, the locked study, the riddles, the poisonings, and the shadows that had danced around each clue. His words were measured, weaving the disparate threads into a coherent tapestry that none could deny. "One might think," Holmes said, "that this tale is a mere exercise in shadows and puzzles. Yet beneath these riddles lay a very human tragedy. Ambition, fear, loyalty, and betrayal intertwined in a deadly dance." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Turning to the assembled company, Holmes addressed each in turn, revealing the roles they had unwittingly or knowingly played. He spoke of Camden's attempts to maintain control over the smuggling ring, the letters Miss Linton had concealed, and the silent complicity of Mr. Hargrove. To Simmons, he offered words of cautious exoneration, acknowledging the man's loyalty despite circumstances beyond his control. The room grew tense as Holmes unveiled the evidence that had sealed Camden's guilt, the forged documents, the coded letters, and the subtle traces of poison. Each piece was laid bare with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through layers of deception until only the raw truth remained. As the revelations unfolded, I watched the faces of those present, some pale with shock, others hardened by desperation. Miss Linton's composure broke, tears spilling freely as she confessed to withholding letters out of fear. Mr. Hargrove remained stoic, his acceptance of culpability quiet but complete. Holmes's voice softened as he spoke of the man at the heart of the tragedy, Barnaby Fletcher, a man caught in the crossfire of greed and secrecy, whose efforts to expose the darkness had cost him his life. The riddles were his final voice, Holmes said solemnly, a call for justice wrapped in cryptic verses, a plea that did not go unheard. Lestrade stepped forward to take charge of the proceedings, ensuring that the culprits would be taken into custody and justice served. Holmes turned to me then, his expression one of quiet satisfaction tempered by the knowledge of the fragile peace that had been restored. As the guests departed, the weight of the case seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the lingering echoes of lessons learned and the truths uncovered. Holmes and I remained by the window, watching the city bustle below, its streets once again oblivious to the dramas that had played out in their midst. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "the final gathering is both an end and a beginning. It reminds us that behind every mystery lies a tapestry of human frailty and strength, and that even the darkest riddles can be unraveled by the light of reason." I nodded, grateful to have witnessed once more the brilliance of Holmes's mind and the enduring power of truth. The man who spoke in riddles had been unmasked, his secrets laid bare, and justice set in motion, but the city's fog would always conceal new mysteries, waiting patiently for the next seeker of truth. Ask ChatGPT Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The room at Baker Street was quiet, but charged with expectation. The gathered guests now fewer in number, yet every one of them burdened by the weight of what was to come. Holmes stood before us, the flickering fire casting shadows that danced with his steady presence. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, surveyed the faces of those assembled, each etched with the scars of suspicion, fear, and weary resolve. It was a moment that seemed suspended in time, an hour when the veil would be lifted and the tangled web unraveled at last. Holmes began with the first fragments of the case, the locked study where Barnaby Fletcher was found dead, riddles stuffed between his lips as though to speak from beyond the grave. He recalled the seemingly impossible nature of the crime. No forced entry, no weapon, no immediate cause discernible. Yet Holmes's acute observations revealed subtle signs, the dust on the windowsill, the faint metallic residue, and the carefully concealed messages that held the key to everything. He described how Fletcher's ambition to expose a sprawling smuggling ring had placed him in peril, his threats cloaked in riddles meant to warn and confuse. The letters discovered, the cryptic verses, and the whispered signals in the night all served as threads in a fabric of deception and fear. Holmes then turned to the suspects, unfolding the complex relationships and motivations that bound them. Mr. Camden, with his sharp temper and desperate grasp for control, had orchestrated the smuggling operation and resorted to murder to protect his interests. Miss Linton, torn between loyalty and fear, had hidden critical letters that could have altered the course of justice sooner. Mr. Hargrove, though silent, had aided the concealment of shipments and misled the authorities with quiet acquiescence. Holmes traced the movements of the key players on that fateful night, drawing connections between the second crime, the poisoning of old Reeve, and the signals sent across the docks. The tapping heard was no random sound, but a covert communication among conspirators, a rhythm that dictated the timing of actions meant to deceive and divide. The man who spoke in riddles, Holmes explained, had relied on the complexity of his messages to shield himself, weaving layers of coded language and psychological misdirection. Yet each riddle was also a marker, an unintentional breadcrumb leading the patient and observant to the truth. Holmes recounted the final bait he had laid, the anonymous letter inviting Fletcher's associates to gather, forcing the conspirators into the open. He detailed the verbal duel with the cloaked man who had challenged us, exposing the cracks in his defenses and the desperate maneuvers that preceded his capture. As Holmes spoke, the room seemed to tighten with the weight of revelation. The assembled guests listened in rapt silence, the pieces falling into place with a clarity that was both satisfying and somber. The riddles had not been merely puzzles, but the cries of a man struggling to bring justice to a world shadowed by greed and fear. In concluding, Holmes emphasized the lessons hidden within the case, the dangers of secrecy, the power of persistence, and the enduring strength of reason over deception. His final words resonated with quiet authority. Justice is not served by haste or assumption, but by the careful unveiling of truth, no matter how deeply it is concealed. As the room slowly emptied, the burden of mystery lifted from those present, replaced by a solemn resolve to face the consequences of their actions. Holmes and I remained, the night settling around us as we reflected on the intricate dance of light and shadow we had witnessed. The man who spoke in riddles had been unmasked, his carefully crafted illusions dispelled by the relentless pursuit of truth. And though the city's fog would continue to conceal many secrets, tonight justice had spoken clearly, and reason had prevailed. The room was suffused with a heavy, expectant silence, a quiet charged with the weight of weeks of secrets and shadows. Those gathered in the intimate chamber of Baker Street, the very hearts and minds entwined in the tangled web of Barnaby Fletcher's death, waited with bated breath. The flickering flames in the hearth cast long shadows that danced across the faces around us, faces etched with apprehension, guilt, and the faintest glimmers of hope. Holmes stood poised, the very image of calm intellect sharpened to a fine edge, as he prepared to untangle the threads of mystery that had confounded all others. He began with deliberate care, weaving the tale of that fateful night as though recounting a complex melody composed of discordant notes seeking harmony. Holmes's voice was steady, each word measured, drawing us in not just as listeners, but as participants in the unveiling. The case before us began with an impossible crime, he said, glancing briefly at the locked study door recreated in his mind's eye. A man found dead within a room sealed from within, riddles pressed between his lips, and no visible cause of death. Such a tableau invites speculation, but it is observation that brings clarity. Holmes recounted the small but telling details that had escaped the eyes of others, the faint metallic dust on the windowsill, the almost imperceptible scratch upon the frame, the subtle residue of poison traced to an exotic plant, and the coded messages hidden beneath the flowery language of the riddles themselves. Each clue was not merely a fact, but a signpost on the path to truth. He spoke next of Barnaby Fletcher's life and secret ambitions, his attempts to expose a ruthless smuggling ring threading through the docks of Limehouse. Fletcher's courage in the face of danger, his cryptic warnings encoded in verse, and his ultimately fatal determination to confront the darkness were brought vividly to life. Turning then to the principal figures involved, Holmes laid bare the network of complicity. "Mr. Camden," he began, his gaze settling on the man now subdued and resigned, was the architect of the smuggling operation and the orchestrator of violence cloaked in riddles. His desperation to maintain control led him to murder and subterfuge. Holmes detailed Camden's careful attempts to conceal incriminating documents, his manipulation of others, and his use of riddles not as mere puzzles, but as weapons of psychological warfare designed to mislead and intimidate. Next, Holmes addressed Miss Linton and Mr. Hargrove, revealing their more subtle but no less consequential roles. Miss Linton's fear led her to suppress letters that might have revealed Camden's guilt sooner. Mr. Hargrove's silence and cooperation lent strength to the conspiracy's shadow. Their faces bore the strain of guilt, their complicity laid bare with unflinching honesty. Holmes then described the second crime, the attempted poisoning of old Reeve, and the signals exchanged in the night through the tapping sounds at the docks. These signals were no accident, but a coded communication among the conspirators, marking times and places with precision. "The man who spoke in riddles," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, "wove a veil of complexity to mask a simple truth. A network of greed, fear, and betrayal, ultimately undone by patient observation and relentless reasoning." He then recounted the final bait he had laid, a carefully orchestrated gathering designed to draw the conspirators into the open, forcing the Riddler to confront his own creation. The verbal duel that ensued between Holmes and the cloaked man was vivid in his memory. A clash of minds, riddles, and veiled threats dissolving beneath the pressure of logic and truth. As Holmes narrated, I noted the shifting expressions among those present, fear, relief, and a dawning comprehension as the full measure of their actions and the consequences became undeniable. It was not merely a recounting of events, but a reckoning with the human frailty that had spawned them. Holmes concluded with a measured reflection on the nature of justice and truth. The riddles were more than puzzles. They were cries for understanding in a world too often clouded by silence. It is our duty not only to unravel such mysteries, but to learn from them, to see beyond deception and face the truths that bind us all. The room remained silent as the weight of Holmes's words settled. Then Lestrade stepped forward, assuming the mantle of authority, ensuring that the law would follow through with measured justice, guided by the clarity that had emerged from chaos. As the guests departed, I found myself beside Holmes, the firelight casting a warm glow on his thoughtful face. The triumph of reason over deception was sweet, but tempered by the knowledge that the shadows we had dispelled would one day return, waiting for new seekers to pierce their depths. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "each mystery solved is but a chapter in the eternal book of human nature. Tonight we close one volume, yet many more await our scrutiny." I nodded, filled with the quiet resolve of a man who had witnessed once more the extraordinary power of deduction and the fragile triumph of truth. The riddles had been broken, the silence shattered, and justice restored, at least for now. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the city reborn in the first light of dawn, a world forever changed by the slow but certain march of justice. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The dawn broke with a pale, hesitant light over London, casting long shadows across the city's awakening streets. Within the solemn walls of the magistrate's court, the final act of our long and winding investigation was unfolding. The air was thick with anticipation as those involved in the case gathered to witness justice in its measured course. Holmes and I took our seats quietly, the weight of the past weeks pressing upon us with a gravity that few outside this chamber could understand. The proceedings were methodical, each piece of evidence laid bare under the unblinking gaze of the court. Mr. Camden, now stripped of his cloak of riddles and deception, faced the full measure of the law. His earlier defiance had faded, replaced by a hollow acceptance that came only with the certainty of consequence. The judge's voice was steady and solemn as the charges were read, recounting the smuggling operations, the calculated murders, and the layers of deceit designed to protect greed at the expense of human life. Miss Linton and Mr. Hargrove stood as witnesses, their testimonies fraught with regret and fear. Miss Linton's confession to withholding letters and misleading inquiries had been pivotal, her voice trembling as she recounted the web of silence that had allowed the crimes to fester. Mr. Hargrove's quiet acknowledgement of his complicity spoke volumes, a testament to the tangled loyalties and moral ambiguities that had marked the entire affair. Lestrade moved with practiced efficiency, presenting the case with the thoroughness that had become a hallmark of his collaboration with Holmes. His respect for Holmes's deductions was evident, though he wisely deferred to the court's authority in determining the final outcome. As the court deliberated, Holmes and I exchanged quiet reflections on the nature of justice. The law, Holmes mused softly, is the slow hand that balances society's scales. It is neither swift nor infallible, but it is the framework within which truth must find its place. The verdict was delivered in the early afternoon, a unanimous judgment of guilt, with Camden sentenced to a lengthy term in prison and the smuggling network dismantled through the evidence provided. The court's decision was met with a mixture of relief and sober contemplation among those present. Outside the courtroom, the bustle of the city resumed, oblivious to the quiet resolution of a mystery that had held us captive for weeks. Holmes and I walked in thoughtful silence, the Thames flowing alongside us like an endless thread weaving through the city's story. Holmes spoke at last, his tone reflective. "Justice, Watson, is a complex tapestry. It requires patience, persistence, and above all, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Today, we have seen the fragile balance between law and morality tested and ultimately upheld." I found myself contemplating the journey we had undertaken, from the baffling locked-room death to the tangled conspiracy beneath the docks. The man who spoke in riddles had been brought to account, but the echoes of his cunning lingered, a reminder that human nature is a labyrinth of motives and desires. Back at Baker Street, Holmes settled once more into his chair, a rare smile touching his lips as he regarded the familiar clutter of our rooms. "Cases such as these," he said quietly, "are reminders that beneath every mystery lies the human heart, capable of great darkness, but also of redemption." As the evening deepened, I marveled once more at Holmes's unwavering commitment to truth, his relentless pursuit of justice in a world often veiled in shadows. The riddles had been solved, the silence broken, and the scales balanced, at least for now. And so, with the city's lights twinkling beyond the window pane, we prepared to move forward, knowing that new mysteries awaited and that the game, as always, was far from over. The morning sun cast a pale light over the city of London, yet the weight of the night's revelation still hung heavy upon us. The grim certainty of justice awaited in the somber halls of the magistrate's court, where all involved would face the consequences of their deeds. Holmes and I arrived early, the air thick with tension and the low murmur of anticipation from the gathered crowd. Those who had been part of the dark tapestry of smuggling and murder sat quietly, their faces betraying the turmoil within, guilt, fear, and in some, a desperate hope for mercy. The courtroom was austere, its heavy wooden benches and cold stone walls echoing the gravity of the moment. Holmes stood as the prosecution laid out the case, the evidence assembled with unerring precision. He listened with that keen focus I had come to recognize as the hallmark of his intellect, watching as the judge and jury absorbed the full extent of the crimes. The charges against Mr. Camden were severe: conspiracy, murder, and the orchestration of a criminal enterprise that had cast a shadow over the city's docks. His earlier defiance had been replaced by a hollow resignation, a man who realized that the riddles he once used as a shield had become the very chains that bound him. Miss Linton and Mr. Hargrove testified with sorrowful honesty, their confessions painting a portrait of fear and complicity. Miss Linton spoke of hidden letters and silenced warnings, her voice trembling yet resolute as she faced the court. Mr. Hargrove's silent acceptance carried the weight of decades of compromise, his presence a stark reminder of how darkness can seep into the fabric of society when left unchecked. Lestrade's steady narration of the investigation lent a solemn cadence to the proceedings. His respect for Holmes's deductions was evident, but he rightly deferred to the court's solemn duty. The judge, a man weathered by years of justice served, listened attentively before delivering a verdict that carried the full weight of the law. Guilty. The word fell like a verdict of finality upon those assembled, sealing the fate of the conspirators and restoring a fragile sense of order to the troubled docks. The sentence was just and measured, a reflection not only of the crimes committed, but also of the painstaking pursuit of truth that had brought them to light. Outside, the city stirred to life, the Thames flowing steadily as it had for centuries, indifferent to the fates of men and their follies. Holmes and I walked through the misty streets in contemplative silence. "Justice, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "is a delicate balance. It is neither swift nor infallible, but it is the foundation upon which our society must stand." I thought of the labyrinthine investigation, the riddles, the secret signals, the poisoning, and the betrayals. The man who spoke in riddles had been unmasked, yet the echoes of his cunning lingered in the fog and alleys of the city. Back at Baker Street, Holmes settled once more into his chair, a faint smile touching his lips as he regarded the familiar clutter of our rooms. "Cases such as these," he said softly, "remind us that beneath every mystery lies the human heart, capable of great darkness, but also of redemption." The night deepened, and the city's lights blinked softly beyond the window. Holmes, ever the enigma, was already turning his mind toward new puzzles, new shadows waiting to be pierced by reason's light. The game, as always, was afoot, and the riddles, though answered for now, would one day return in another guise. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. The quiet of Baker Street settled around us like a soft cloak, the flickering fire casting gentle shadows that danced across the walls. After weeks of pursuit and revelation, the case of the man who spoke in riddles had reached its end, yet the weight of the journey lingered in the stillness. Holmes sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes distant but serene, as if contemplating not only the case but the very nature of mystery itself. "Watson," he began, his voice low and measured, "there is a peculiar grace in the resolution of a complex puzzle, yet it is not the final answer that holds the true significance. It is the process, the unfolding of truth through observation, reasoning, and perseverance, that defines our pursuit." He glanced at me, a faint smile playing about his lips. The riddles were but a mask, concealing motives as old as mankind: greed, fear, and the desperate desire to protect one's own. I nodded, feeling the quiet wisdom in his words. Holmes continued, "Cases such as these remind us that human nature is a tapestry of contradictions. The cleverest deceptions often arise from the simplest desires, and the darkest secrets from the most vulnerable hearts." He paused, then added with a gentle humility, "And yet, despite all the darkness we uncover, the light of reason remains our greatest weapon. As I have said many times before, the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observed." Leaning forward, Holmes reached for his pipe, lighting it with deliberate care. "The game of deduction is eternal, Watson. One case closes, and another waits patiently in the shadows. Our task is to remain vigilant, to listen for the riddles hidden beneath the surface, and to seek the truth with unyielding resolve." As I watched him, the man who had guided me through so many enigmas, I felt a profound sense of gratitude and admiration. Holmes's brilliance was not only in his intellect, but in his unwavering dedication to justice and the relentless pursuit of clarity amid confusion. The night deepened, and the city outside grew hushed, the distant murmur of life softened by the veil of darkness. Within our rooms, the embers glowed warmly, a symbol, perhaps, of the enduring light that guides those who seek truth. "Come, Watson," Holmes said softly, rising from his chair. "Let us rest. Tomorrow new mysteries will call, and the game will be afoot once more." And with that, we prepared to leave behind the case of the man who spoke in riddles, its shadows dispelled, its secrets unveiled, and its lessons etched forever in the annals of reason and justice. The fire's glow softened the shadows in our Baker Street rooms as Holmes settled into his chair, his gaze distant yet calm. "Watson," he said quietly, "the truth we seek is often hidden beneath layers of riddles, but reason is the light that unveils it. This case, like many before, reminds us that behind every puzzle lies the complexity of the human heart." He smiled faintly. "The game is never truly over. There will always be new mysteries, new riddles to solve, and we must be ready, for the game will always be afoot." I nodded, knowing this was but a pause before the next pursuit of truth.